The following is a true story. This is an average American family whose strong moral, ethical, and religious commitments were tested to the limits. It is a story about a mother who protected and sheltered her family against all the temptations associated with everyday life. And it's a story about her son, whose desire to be accepted by his peers led him down a pathway to destruction. It is a family whose very fabric was ripped apart by drugs. This, then, is the true story of Josh and Cheryl Sales.
He was different, I think, than what they thought he was. You know, he had the spiked hair and the short hair. He's really cute, and he was real popular at first. But then he's not real sports-minded, so he wasn't accepted by the sports crowd, which is very big up here. And he tended to start getting picked on then.
My natural need to feel accepted, I started using because the people that use are the people that will accept you no matter what.
And still thought everything was kind of going fine. He wasn't doing well in school.
As I started to use more and more, I got more and more friends.
I would get on him about school, and we would go around and around about that, and he'd just tell me how much he hated it.
I started getting belligerent, and I would come home high and I would yell at my parents.
You know, Josh was just causing all kinds of grief.
We maybe had 10 minutes of conversation a day, and it was all arguing, cussing, swearing.
I kind of thought maybe he was using drugs, but I did everything that people tell you to do. You know, check their rooms and look at their eyes. And
I'd smoke pot, and then that would get boring, so I would start, I started eating mushrooms around like probably about my freshman, sophomore year, and then that got boring. And then I would, do something else, and I would always swear that I'll never do the next step. And I always, would go up to that next step, and then I would say another thing that, oh, I'll never do that, and then it just kind of kept, going up from there.
And see, and I kept telling my husband that I think that he was using drugs, and he kept telling me, oh, no, not Josh. He wouldn't be using drugs.
So I started using, acid, and then a couple times, I wanted more than that, so I used mescaline. And then from there I went over to popping pills, because again, I hit that peak and I started being wound up all the time, so I want to go back down. So I started using pills and heroin, GHB.
And he came home and he actually told me, he says, he was high and that he'd been using drugs for a long time. I felt so stupid that I hadn't known, I couldn't believe that I could overlook that, not my kid.
They tried grounding me, they tried everything else, and I would just walk out on it. I never really cared.
We had a verbal confrontation, and he grabbed me and hit me, and I said, well, I've had enough, I'm going to call the police, and I picked up the phone to call the police, and he left.
Joshua Sales' mother called the police department to report her son basically out of control, that he was being disorderly and threatening to her.
We didn't hear from him or see him until 5 days later. He comes home, he knocks at the door. It's probably about 9 o'clock at night. They told us not to let him in the house, to make sure we called him.
We transported him up to Rogue Valley Hospital for a mental evaluation.
He looked terrible. He hadn't had a shower in 5 days. I don't even know where he was for the whole 5 days.
She was very frustrated to the point of hopeless. What am I going to do? I don't know what to do anymore.
He was so mad at me that I would do this to him, that it was our fault that he's doing this. He's been abused his whole life and, all this stuff.
And I went to the Catherine Freer program for 21 days. And I got back and I lied and I lied and I lied, and I was, and my PO believed me until I got a dirty UA again. And then I went to the on-track, or actually I went to Copia, and then I got kicked out of there.
It just got worse and worse, and he was gone for longer periods of time.
And I went over to the on-track outpatient. I graduated from there, lying my way through it, and just fixing my tests and stuff so I'd pass them.
He had manipulated his way through all of them. He's smart, verbal, and could say the right things.
I got out of it in like December, And then next January is when I started going to raves.
I just thought they were concerts. You know, people would go, local bands would go and play. I had no idea what went on at raves. No idea at all. I thought they were harmless.
The whole reason why I started going to raves at first was because I liked hallucinogens, and they were kind of hard to find, but they were easy to find there. So I started going there, and you know, it got just opened up to a whole new culture of drugs and stuff that I'd never even heard of before.
He just continued to get more violent, continued to come and go as he pleased.
And we'd come home and usually pass out, but for some odd reason after I went to a rave and got loaded all night, I'd only sleep for about 4 hours for some odd reason. And then I'd wake up, and usually all my other friends would be passed out, and yeah, I'd just do G by myself until they woke up. And then, you know, I was automatically, just like you would be sober all day, I was on G all day long.
Well, we went to court, and we got a new probation officer.
I met Josh when he was placed on probation for domestic violence.
He hated her, just hated her, because she was so involved in his life.
He was fairly compliant for a couple of months. With his history, however, and his behaviors, it didn't take long for his behavior to decline.
He found more people to party with.
His parents and I had started to detect that he was either heavily using or heavily selling.
There was also more physical abuse that he did to me. One day he got mad at me and pushed me, and I broke a table and bruises all over my back. And he comes home a couple days later and says he never did it, that I was imagining things.
At one point in time, I tried to quit because I knew I had a problem with it, and it's just like heroin. It's like your body needs it.
I was just waiting for him to be 18 so I could just kick him out because I had had enough. I actually, for the first time in my life, hated my kid. I absolutely hated him.
I think that when parents have done as much as they can to get control over their child, to regain the control that they've lost, if it's not working, they need to call the police. They need to get the child involved in the system because the system can help them control their child.
So this was one of the times we were going out of town, and he went and stayed with a friend, and the friend was a good friend. And come to find out, I took him there, but he didn't stay there that weekend. He went up to Roseburg to a rave.
To me, there wasn't really anything else but getting high, and for me, I was going to die getting high. It didn't matter. It was the only thing that did matter, and if I had to die doing it, then that's what I was willing to take.
We had come down in here to the fairgrounds. We had gotten information from another officer who worked with state police that there was a rave party down here.
You know, there's going to be a lot of bright lights. The music's going to be really loud, and once we get high, we'll probably go sit down in a corner for the rest of the night.
And there are a lot of kids sitting around the outside edges against the wall.
I was smoking a cigarette inside a rave, and they asked me for ID.
One of the things that we keyed in on that got our attention was that he was high, under the influence, stoned, whatever you want to call it. We could tell that he was under the influence of something.
And I wasn't 18, and so they searched me. And
took all the little balloons he had and all his whippets, took the cracker for opening the nitrous canisters, and he had about $300 in cash on him, and we took that too. I asked him, what's the money from? He said, selling E, the ecstasy.
The other people that they arrested, they all asked him, they said, well, we'll let you off a little, we'll cut you some slack if you tell us, who sold you the E and stuff, and, all the fingers are pointed at me.
Well, that night he got off pretty lucky. If he would have had ecstasy, it would have been a really different night for Josh.
Ecstasy of any amount,
Okay.
marijuana of more than 1 ounce, methamphetamine of any amount is a felony charge. So they're looking at between 5 and 20 years, depending on the particular drug. It varies in terms of what the consequence is, the maximum penalty, but the least is 5 years, the most is 20.
When I got back, I picked him up from his mental health appointment, and he says, I really got to tell you the truth that happened. He says, I was cited at the rave for inhalants.
When Josh was cited in Roseburg, he became extremely worried about telling me.
I said, well, you need to call Kelly and tell her that you got cited.
Matter of fact, he refused to tell me.
So I went in and saw Kelly myself, and I took the citation, and she was just blown away because he had conned her.
I was in shock at his involvement in selling drugs and the amount of drugs and the type of drugs that he was actually selling.
I went and picked him up, and I told him that Kelly wanted you to take a polygraph. He says, I don't want to take a polygraph. He says, you know, so he called her and tried to get out of the polygraph. She said, no, you're going to take it.
Once he took the polygraph test, it became very clear how involved and entrenched he was in the drug system.
So we went down there. She didn't even, we walked in the door, she walked out the door, grabbed him by the arm and took him and locked him up in detention.
And that time that he spent in detention was a real eye-opener for Josh. He hadn't really been in detention a whole lot prior to that time.
And we went to her office and I read the polygraph. I had never been so sick in my life, thinking I knew what my kid was doing. I never knew half the stuff he was doing.
Josh was lodged in detention for approximately 2 months.
By the second week, he's getting a little stir crazy, you know. So he just kept telling us he wanted out of there. He learned his lesson. He was, you know, he's going to get out of there. He can come home. He can handle it. He can get off of drugs. He can do it all on his own.
Josh did not like being in detention. The loss of freedom was a very good thing for him.
Finally, she called us in her office and she said she decided what to do, that to send him to this new residential program.
He was one of the most drug-affected kids I've ever seen.
You know, at first I went in there kicking and screaming, and for a whole month I sat in there and I did nothing.
You get kids in there, and after a couple days, they want out.
We told him that he was going to stay here or he was going to a long-term program.
One of the biggest challenges with Josh was getting him to realize that his participation in the drug use, whether it be selling or using, was making his life harder on him, and his alienating himself from his family was truly making life harder.
Josh could bring out so much anger in you that you couldn't believe that you could get that mad. There's no way you could believe you could get that mad. There's no way. I mean, there was plenty of times I would think, you know, if I would just end my life, I would be away from all of this, you know, because it's just, it's so hard going through it.
Josh and Cheryl and I didn't spend a lot of time laughing together.
And I would be at work and I would just be so upset I would break down. I mean, I just couldn't even physically work because he had just disrupted so many things at home.
He was sick physically.
I couldn't eat anything, and I would throw up, and I would dry heave all day.
The other thing is that he was on an emotional roller coaster, which is real typical of withdrawal. It's this 1 minute I'm angry and I don't know why, really angry, and the next minute I want to cry and I'm really depressed, and it's just this like unpredictable mood swings.
I think if it wasn't for our faith, we wouldn't have, our marriage would have never made it. I know it wouldn't have made it. There's no way. There's no way. Because it was just too stressful.
The treatment process is set up so that there are basic expectations, rules, which would be responsibility, taking a shower, doing chores, basic human skills, which often go by the wayside. The second component is almost a value kind of thing, honesty, respect for others, that kind of thing. In this particular program, you cannot move through the program without changing in all those areas.
They have scales that they have to go up. I think there's 6 of them. And he wasn't going anywhere. He's still on the first level. And so finally she said, she called Kelly in again, and they had a talk. And she says, you either start moving or I'm going to send you to the prison out in Grants Pass. I'm not trying anymore with you, Josh. This is your last opportunity.
Josh's self-esteem was really, really low. And somewhere maybe 3 to 4 weeks into the program, I think he started to feel better about himself. And that, to me, is the hook for recovery.
It's seeing that all these other people that have been through the exact same thing that I've been through, you know, they can change their life and they can do something different with theirs. And, you know, there's no reason why I can't have this too.
He started going up slowly, get discouraged, go back down a level.
It's a lot of hard work, and that's, you know, another component. I'm willing to do the work, and I'm willing to be accountable. I'm not going to blame. I'm not going to make excuses.
Josh and Cheryl and I, and Todd, his father, worked really hard on trying to get him a job. And Josh, when he first came into my office, had very long, greasy hair and a long goatee.
And she described Josh as looking like Charles Manson.
He went through one of the treatment groups and decided in that time period that he was going to clean up. And he cut his hair and he shaved off his facial hair. And we were so proud of him that he chose to do that on his own, because we didn't force him to do it. He chose to do that on his own.
He liked himself when he got clean and sober, and when he quit using, and he liked what happened to him, and he started to feel joy. And I think the biggest thing of all, hope.
I know that Josh's parents were ready to throw in the towel. They had done so much, literally and financially, for Josh, but they didn't throw in the towel. They just kept going, even though it was going to cost them a lot of money and a lot of effort that they didn't have the energy for. He had worn them out, but they kept going, and now they're reaping the benefits of not giving up.
I always came to Josh's rescue for everything. I never made Josh deal with anything, confront anything. I always was there for him.
I think it's so tempting as a parent to always rescue our children from what they're doing, and sometimes they need to learn by their own mistakes. And I know as a parent, that's one of the hardest things you can have to do as a parent.
Parents need to hold their kids accountable, and they need to not deny that there's a possibility of a drug problem.
All of our children are exposed and tempted and offered drugs and alcohol starting in at least middle school and on in our community. And understanding and being able to look for what some of the symptoms are.
Some of the signs that you should look for as a parent to indicate your child has a drug problem would be change in their grades, change in their friends. That's a big one. They'll be hanging around the good neighbor kids, and next thing you know, they're not hanging around the good neighbor kids anymore.
It's looking at the whole picture, looking at the characteristics, looking at whatever kind of paraphernalia the kid has in their room. And parents will say, well, what kind of stuff should I look for? Anything that you don't know what it is. That's the answer.
Finally, we got to the point where he was going to graduate. He was in there like 110 days. He had had almost 4 months of sobriety. Nothing. He felt so good and healthy.
There was a moment with Josh, and it happens with every kid who's gotten it, where I look at this kid and they look me in the eyes, and the eyes are clear and the complexion's good, and there's this health both physically and emotionally, and this smile that is absolutely, completely real. And there's no deception in the eyes, and that's when that real person shows up. And when that happens, I know they've got it. And I knew he was sitting in my office, and I looked at him, and he looked me in the eye and smiled, and I knew it was internal. I knew he had it. because it wasn't faked. You can't fake that.
He's back to the old guy. He is. Actually, we laugh now, and he's actually got his permit back because he got his permit taken away when he got that MIP. And he's actually driving me around now again at 18, and he's getting his license, and that's pretty funny because I'm pretty hard on him, and he laughs and makes jokes when I'm hard instead of getting back in my face like he would have years ago.
I believe that Josh will be thankful that he got caught. I think especially now, since he's been through outpatient drug and alcohol treatment, he's able to see what the future holds for him.
I've built, a strong support system in NA of people that I can call, people that I can hang out with, people that really, care about me. And that, through experimenting and, being sober, I just, learning ways to get more and more friends.
Stick to the basics of living. Have a set of principles to guide you, because when there are so many times in life when you have to make decisions and the answers aren't very clear-cut, and at that point, a set of guiding principles: I won't lie, I won't steal, I won't, I'll do my best not to hurt myself or another human being.
He's the old Josh that we know and love, and he's just a sweetheart now. And he's accomplished so much. I mean, he has, and he's done it for himself, because if he didn't want to do it, he wouldn't have had to do it, really.
Take me home, take me